recording first. Yay. So I'll just start with a little bit about me. I spoke a few years ago as well. Some of you might remember my face. My name's Dickson. I'm a senior development manager at Agoda. I'm also an open source contributor. I work on a project called NUnit, if any of you here work on .NET. I've been coming to Thailand for about over 10 years now for business, but I live in Bangkok these days. I'm originally from Australia, and I like beer and sport. So just a bit of a disclaimer, some of the things I'm going to talk about today are specific to the context that we have at Agoda. They might not work for you because you don't have the same context as us, but try them. Like, the worst that can happen is you might learn something. I should also put another disclaimer, is that Agoda has a very large engineering department, and some of the things I'm going to talk about are experiments we did in our area. And if you know some of the guys work at Agoda in, say, the ML area, they probably won't have heard of some of the stuff I'm talking about today. So, how did we get here? So, I'm going to give you guys a bit of a background about where this talk comes from today. Basically, we were talking to some engineers at Agoda that were really sad. And I don't like my engineers being sad. I like them to be happy. So we wanted to find out what exactly was making them sad. So one of the things that we do at Agoda is we're very data driven. So we use survey data to collect information from the developers. We have a people survey that goes out, and we also do these contributor surveys after someone contributes to a particular project at Agoda. We ask them questions about what the experience was like. Were the tests easy to run, things like that. And so we got a bunch of data out from the developers, and what we learned from it is we have sad engineers. And again, we like to make our engineers happy, but first we have to understand why they're sad. And based on the survey data and the conversations we had, it was pretty much similar things in a lot of the projects: long compilation times, flaky tests, poorly written code, hard to get things to production. Similar kind of theme of the complaints. But at Agoda, we don't just use people's opinions. We like to collect actual data that we can measure, so that we can experiment with things, we can measure our success properly, and also it helps us prioritize to make sure we get the right things done first. So some of the things, or how can we measure these kinds of problems with our systems that are making people sad? One of the things that we use in some areas at Agoda, but not all, but I think this one's an interesting one to mention because you can Google this, 4 key DevOps metrics. And there's a lot of research by companies like Microsoft and GitHub into this. And they're 4 metrics that you can easily measure on your project to tell you some interesting stuff about what the experience is like for the developers. Time to market, or lead time, is another one that we look at to measure what these problems are like. Static code analysis is an interesting one. It's not the best one by far, but it's definitely one that you can use. And time to dev feedback. So I wanted to call this one out because we're doing a lot of work on this at Agoda, and it's probably some stuff that we'll be open sourcing in Q1 next year. So you can keep an eye on our github.com org for updates on that. But what time to dev feedback is, we try and measure the time it takes from when someone's finished writing their code to when they can test the changes, or how long it takes. So this is compilation time and also local test time. And we're getting some pretty interesting results from this one as we're starting to measure it. But it's key to the developer experience is, if it takes 30 minutes to compile your app to find out that something's broken, your developers are going to have a pretty sad experience working at your company. And also the contributor surveys we use as well, which I showed up before. So why aren't people fixing these things, which was the next question. So we asked the sad engineers, why aren't they getting fixed? Why aren't people just fixing them? So the feedback that we got was responses like, I don't understand how it got like this in the first place. Or, why should I clean up someone else's mess? Or, it's not my problem on my system. And one of the big bits of feedback we got was, I don't have time, or I'm too busy. So these are 3 of the issues that I want to address today and talk about how we solve them at Agoda. So, which is, I don't have time, it's not my problem, and how did it get like this? So the first one, I don't have time, we have an unwritten rule at Agoda, which is the 30-70 rule. So we've got this philosophy that a product team should spend at least 30% of their time on technical work. And what's technical work? It's things like cleaning up your technical debt, refactoring, improvements to the code, and things like this. So we don't make it a hard and fast rule though. We don't say to teams every sprint backlog it should be 30% technical work, and that's a rule. We're flexible with teams about it so they can play around with the numbers, but we believe it should even out to this, and then that's what we think. There's a few other companies that do things similar. Atlassian, both of these are Australian companies, that's just a coincidence. The Atlassian have what they call the 20% time. So 20% of your time as an engineer at Atlassian, you should not be spending on your sprint work. It should be spent on other things that you can choose. Now, they like you to relate it back to the work you're doing. So essentially 1 day a week you get as an engineer at Atlassian to work on other projects. And there's a lot of guys at Atlassian that are big contributors to projects like the React libraries that are out there, because they spend their 20% time to do things like fix bugs that they find in React Router. They also have Ship It Day, which is a regular hackathon that they do. It's a 24-hour hackathon where the developers get to build something. The one at Domain, they have Innovation Day every couple of months, which I think is an interesting one because at Domain, Innovation Day is completely open. You don't have to relate what you build back to what you're working on. So an example of where, I don't know if this is a success or failure, but in 2016 at one of their Innovation Days, I think the quote from the blog post was, sometimes at Innovation Days we get things that revolutionize the way we work, and sometimes we get Coffee Cow. So what Coffee Cow was a project that they did on Innovation Day where they could order coffee from the local coffee shop using a Slack bot. They also did a smartwatch app. They went that far so they could track the progress of their coffee orders. So yeah, but it's a lot of fun. But again, these are the sort of things that help developers make their lives easier and also make them happier. So engineering teams is another thing that we've tried. And that's a team that focuses on doing only tech work. My experience with these, though, is that sometimes they're too far removed from the problems that they're trying to solve. I'm a big believer in the philosophy that the person closest to the problem is the best one to fix it. So another thing that happened was my interns that were working with me gave these guys the nickname the janitors, because they end up cleaning up other people's mess. Which isn't a good experience. So what did we learn? So what we learned from this exercise is that we need to make time for all of our engineers to do technical work, to clean things up, to make things better, to make their lives easier on a day-to-day basis. So the next one I want to talk about is, it's not my problem. So I'm going to take a bit of a tangent here to talk about a few other subjects, and then I'll loop back. So a bit of a case study. So DevOps is a culture. So a lot of companies that I know have a DevOps team, but DevOps is actually meant to be a culture. So the rise of DevOps as a culture, if anyone's interested, there's a good article on Martin Fowler's blog about it, from I think about 2015. But one of the things in this article that he mentions is about sharing the operations staff pain. And this is one of the keys to making a DevOps culture work, is if the software team shares the pain of the operations team, they inherently will design stuff that is easy to maintain, easier to deploy, and so on. So what DevOps culture is we take, and this is the DevOps revolution from 5-10 years ago, is we took development teams and operations teams responsible for the production, development teams responsible for the software, and we merged them together to make a new big pixelated team, which is a dev team with DevOps culture, which is responsible to end-to-end delivery. If you have something like this isn't DevOps culture, because you end up splitting the responsibility even more, and the people don't share the pain. So that's a segue into the next topic, and thanks Pete for fixing my segue spelling earlier. So code ownership. So again, another thing from Martin Fowler's blog, I'm giving this guy a bit of a plug today. He defines code ownership into 3 key areas, which I think is interesting. Strong code ownership, weak code ownership, and collective code ownership. Now, strong code ownership is a state where you've got one person or team that's responsible for a piece of code. It may be an application, a system, a Git repo, and they're the only people that are allowed to make changes to that code. Now, generally you get in this situation when you've got a lack of test automation, so someone has to be extremely familiar with the code to change it so they don't break it. Weak code ownership is how the open source community operates. So you have code owners in this state, but anyone can propose changes to the code. They just need to get those changes approved by the owner. So you have usually a code review process, things get approved by the code owner and they go in. Collective code ownership is where you essentially, everyone owns all the code. So this is generally, for me, it's a bit of a nirvana state. And I've seen this work in small areas, but not at scale yet. So at Agoda, we strive for what we call a pull request culture, or inner source, which is kind of a state of weak code ownership. And this one is one of the things that I love. It's a perfect example of a pull request culture in the open source community. I don't know if you guys can see that. This is me commenting on an issue on the end unit repo, and Rob replied to me and said, hey, that sounds like a good idea. We'll put it on our backlog and prioritize it later. But by the way, we accept pull requests, and gave me a wink. And this is, I think, a good example of encouraging cross-collaboration. Example how weak code ownership can work quite well. But it can make the problem, but it's not my problem, worse, is what we've found. So what happened? So is this a barrier to collective code ownership? So we found in our organization, at least, or in my area, without ownership over code, people tend to care less about the code. So if you have a team that doesn't own any code, doesn't own any systems, they tend to care less about the code, is what we found. So can collective code ownership work? Probably, but I haven't made it work at scale yet. So the change to team or system ownership that we made was each team or group owns a code or system. So that means that you own it. You feel the pain when others contribute to your code, and you start to become part of the solution. So what we found is it works better instead of having a team that doesn't own anything and just contributes across areas, to have that team also own code or a system as well, or be part of the ownership with other teams. It helps them understand the pain and feel the pain. And a similar thing to what we saw before with the DevOps culture is people sharing in the pain helps them share in the solution. So what did we learn from this? We learned that giving ownership encourages engineers to take responsibility. And this is a key thing about making a better culture. So how did we get like this is the last point. So do some engineers like to write bad code? Like, who does this? Where does all this bad code come from? So what we did is we found some bad code, and then we went to talk to the guys that wrote it and try to understand why. And so the question was, do we have evil engineers that are just out to go and write bad code everywhere? No, we don't have evil engineers. What we found was, it was primarily, it was a lack of knowledge. It was just guys that, it was the first time they've written C# code. They were JavaScript developers before, and they found Dynamics for the first time and went, yay, not understanding how things work under the bonnet. So, how to fix them? Do we have any teams without this problem was the next question we asked. And we had a look at a few of the other teams and systems to see, are there any systems that have got quite nice code? And we had a look at the Agoda mobile app a while back. And we found the code base wasn't too bad. You know, it wasn't the best, but it didn't have a lot of the problems that the other ones did. And we asked ourselves what was different here. So what we found is that the Agoda app for quite a few years had a very strong onboarding program. And I thought it was pretty cool. It's a 6 to 8 weeks buddy program that they do. And during that buddy program, you take an app that's completely broken and you have to slowly refactor it and improve the code and make it better. And so what we basically do is train people to identify bad code and clean it up as a part of their onboarding program. And it worked well for a few years. So how to fix them? So I think the answer here is really creating opportunities for engineers to learn and share knowledge is what we found. So I call it continuous learning. So strong onboarding program, regular workshops and tech talks is something we've introduced. Techniques like pair and mob programming. I don't know if Ruf's still here. He was the one that introduced me to mob programming a few years ago. It's an amazing tool to teach people to share and share in their learnings and learn together. And also learn through doing and encouraging other techniques to share knowledge as well. So it's not just about classroom education for people. It's about continuous sharing of knowledge and giving people the tools and techniques to be able to do that. And also making time for them. So another example is Facebook. I've got a few friends that work at Facebook now. Facebook have an 8-week onboarding program. It's very intensive. But after that onboarding program, in that 8 weeks, they give you all of the tools to be a Facebook developer. You know how to write code like they do. You know how to interact with other people like they do. You know all the systems you need to know to work at the company. Now, 8 weeks I think is a bit of a long time, but I've heard some amazing things about this from the guys that work there. So what did we learn from this? We learned that you need to make time to educate your engineers and give them tools to share knowledge. And also don't stop doing it. So that was my last point. Cool. That's it. Is there any questions, guys?
Any question? I think in your first point you mentioned that the tech time, the 20 or 30%,
Yep,
is not part of the sprint. How do you how do you do that?
it's a good question. So it varies per team, and like I said, it's not like a set procedure. Some of the teams, they make it part of the sprint, so they'll actually negotiate with the PO and they'll say, hey, this sprint we want to put 20% of technical stories on the sprint, next sprint maybe 40 and things like that, and throw things around. So it's a negotiation with product. But some teams do things differently. Like one of my teams, they do what they call a code day every sprint. So they'll take one day a sprint where the whole team just takes off and works on technical things, but that takes 10% out of that 30%. So they still have another 20% to play around with for other things. So we leave it open to the teams that vary. So it's really just a very broad, not really direction, but advice from top down to make this kind of thing work in this ratio, and it should end up good. But the way they do it at Atlassian, a friend of mine's just moved over there, and he was actually, I don't know how they track it there, but he was actually contacted in his first month of working there by his boss and said, you're in trouble because you're not spending your 20% time. Because they're very adamant about people doing it.
You mentioned when you were using GitHub and they suggested you PR'd the change yourself.
Yep.
I find the biggest barrier to that is that to make your first PR, you have to go from not knowing anything about a product to knowing enough to contribute. I think that's the biggest reason why you don't get more PRs.
Yes.
Internally, you're talking about teams contributing to other teams' code.
Yes.
And you also mentioned onboarding.
Yes.
Do you think you need some kind of process to, like, say I'm in a different team and I want to contribute to your team, can I kind of request to be onboarded?
It's a good question, and there's a couple of answers to it. So when we think about the open source community, and that's who we should, I think, look to how to solve this problem. Because with the open source community, if your code is too hard to set up and it's too hard to understand, people won't contribute to your code and your project will die. So with the open source community, you have to optimize for a minimal amount of onboarding so you get more contributors. Now, internally, it's quite interesting because we don't generally optimize this for internally, because if your manager says, for example, you have to go work on this project, you have to go work on that project. And there's no incentive generally internally within an enterprise for other teams to optimize for contribution. And I was actually talking to some of the researchers from GitHub, because they've been looking into this problem internally, and that they've started to measure things at enterprises, like how long it takes to set up a project for the first time, how long it takes to run the tests, and how long it takes to deploy changes. And some of the data they got back from these questions was horrific. Like, I remember one of the averages from a certain segment of companies was like 1 week to set up a project for the first time. And I think internally, you do have a lot of these problems. So it depends on what you optimize for. And it's definitely something that if you want to encourage a lot of cross-contribution internally, you have to optimize for fast setup of your project. And it's something internally at Agoda that we've done a lot of work on some of our projects that are very high traffic, is made them easier to set up, easier to debug, and things like that. Also working cross-platform, because not all of our guys use Mac, some of them use Windows. And it's something you have to put some effort into. Although when it comes to onboarding, one of the things that scares me is I think that when you onboard people, if you're onboarding them and you're teaching them patterns and practices, and this is the way we do things, you're doing it right. If you're onboarding people and you're teaching them, this is how we do things in this system, this is how we do things in that system, and this is how we do things differently again in this system, then you've got something you need to fix, generally. If you're working on a new system, generally what you should have to learn is the business domain, is my opinion on it.
I've just got a related horror story to getting set up. The first big team I worked in, to get started, you had to get a clone of the production database, because nobody on the team knew how to recreate it. So there was always a step where you copied it and then tried to remove the sensitive data. Related question to that. You mentioned you have product teams and engineering teams. Do you think some of your issues would go away if you had kind of more vertical, somehow every team is related to the product, or somehow every team is related to a client need?
We do that kind of with our product teams, and the engineering teams. We're trying all different things at the moment at Agoda. And so in my particular area, we're trying to get the engineering team working very close with 3 product teams so they can better understand the problems. And, also involve people in, exchange programs and things like that, so that you can get the experience of what it's like to work with the other guys. And so we're trying all different things. I don't think there's one thing that we've found that's the silver bullet solution.
Hi, I have a question here. So, what can you give an example? What is the good tools that we should give to the team for them to learn?
Good tools.
Yeah.
No, I think it depends on your stack. Yeah. It's an interesting. It depends on your stack. Like, for example, if you're a C# developer, I would say definitely use LingQ. But then that's not appropriate for other languages. If you're working on React, I'd say check out WebStorm. So I think what technology stack are you working on?
So I think the last slide that you mentioned is I interpretation that we should give the some tools to the developer them to learn, right? Continue learning, thing like that. So the tools might be there.
Oh, you mean not okay? You mean
Yeah.
like tech? Yeah,
Yes.
practices. Yeah,
Sorry.
yeah. Mob programming is one that I've found to be awesome. The other thing we do a lot is we set up pairing stations in my area so people can more easily do pair programming. And there's so many. Like I don't really know where to start. I'd recommend like reaching out to a lot of the tech talks and groups that happen locally, so that you can learn about new ones that come up all the time. There was one that my guys were doing the other day called I think it was a push dance or something, where when they're ready with a pull request, they get together and go over the code in like a little huddle, and there's a story kickoff. So whenever they kick off a story or start a story during the sprint, they do a 15-minute huddle together and discuss how they're going to implement the story and things like that. So there's lots and lots. I'd recommend just going to some of the local community talks and things like that. Yeah, especially the guys at Odds. They're pretty good with stuff like this. And ThoughtWorks as well usually does some good meetups where they talk about a lot of these kind of tools. Yeah. Or come along to the Tech at Agoda Tech Talks as well. We'll probably have some there. Yeah. Yep.
When we talk about culture, creating culture might need like a decade or century to do it, right? And how has Agoda construct culture there, and then can spread Agoda across the world quickly?
I don't know. Like I think culture is something. It's not something that we try and push on people, right? It's something that people kind of grow themselves, and we kind of give them the tools to help them grow a better culture. So yeah, it's a hard question to answer.
I should be there to learn from you.
Yeah.
Be Agoda.
I'm particularly interesting in your onboarding program. Can you share us a little bit more? What does it look like? Like, is it a classroom training? Are they working on the real project in that like 6 to 8 weeks you're talking about? How does
Yeah, the buddy program. So we've actually tried it in a few different formats. One of the formats is like it was like the first 2 days is full-time training, but it's not classroom training. It's kind of you're given exercises to do, and then after that you start working on a real scrum team, like a real sprint work, but you spend like a couple hours a day doing the exercises on the side. And then you do that for like 6 to 8 weeks, and then you've finished off all the exercises and you've done all the learning. The one at Facebook that my friends told me about was the it was actual classroom training. Like they take you away and it's like 8 weeks solid. You're taken out of the company, and you exit that training and you're a Facebook guy. Yeah, and we've been toying with a few other formats as well. When we do our interns every year, we do a 2-week intensive classroom program, but that's because we have a large intake. We might have 15 or 20 people to take through, and because they're interns, they need a lot more instruction. So we've tried a few different formats.
Right. I may need to know more about like this is on board, right? So, but another part is if the team is like the engineer is already with the team for 2 to 3 years, how you keep maintain those people to inspire them, or like do you do like rotating to other team or something like that?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's something that happens like after people are, they're very excited about learning when they get to a new company for the first year, and then the next second or third year it kinds to dip off usually in any company, not just tech companies. So it's Like I said, we have regular internal tech talks. We do allow people to move around to different teams in Agoda. We had a guy recently that I remember that was working on, a machine learning project for a few years, and then he moved over to work on front end on React code. So, we give people those kind of opportunities. One of the nice things about Agoda is because it's quite large and we work on a variety of things, it's easy to reach out and, get experience in a lot of different areas.
Okay, I think the last question.
Okay. About the engineering culture, right? What if the management, if they're difficult to understand the engineering culture, they just focus on the product that they want because they feel like they hired the engineer to do this for them. But our engineer, right? We are engineer. We have a culture. Yes, everything, just even the relaxed activity is the productivity back to the product also. But I think what I'm trying to explain to the management is quite difficult. So the question is, do you have a shortcut from me to make them understand easily?
No shortcuts.
No shortcut.
We're quite fortunate to have the head of product is actually quite supportive of this. The thing is, like, it's a conversation that you need to have with management about this and explain to them what happens if we don't do this. Which is, you could end up in situations where all of these metrics that I was talking about before get bad. Like, if we keep doing this, it's not going to take us one day to deploy, it's going to take us 1 week to deploy. If we keep doing this, we're not going to have one rollback a week. We're going to have 2 rollbacks a day, and we can't deploy for 2 weeks because things are getting that bad. Developers are going to start to slow down. Stories are going to take longer to develop, and these sort of things. And very worst, it's probably going to end up with you not being able to hire good talent. And it's probably going to end up with your good talent leaving and going to other companies. So there's a lot of different arguments that you can use when you're talking to management about this if they're pushing back against it. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for your interest.
Thank you very
in the
much.
subject. Okay.
Very inspiring.